The night is long, and the shadows are restless. Somewhere out there, in the dead hours when the world holds its breath, something stirs. A soft knock at the door when no one's outside. A whisper in an empty room. A figure standing at the edge of the road, watching, waiting. You tell yourself it's just your imagination, until it isn't. These 5 terrifying late-night horror stories aren't just tales. They are warnings. Echoes of something real, something waiting in the dark for the right moment to reach out for you. If you dare to step into the nightmare, like, share, and subscribe. But be warned. Some stories have a way of sticking with you long after the screen goes dark. Now, turn the lights down low, put on your headphones, and let the terror begin. It was 2:43 a.m. when Maggie's phone rang. Her apartment, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights from outside, felt unnervingly quiet, like the world had shut itself out. The ringtone sliced through the silence, sending a ripple of dread through her. She sat up in bed, the covers tangled around her legs, and stared at the screen. The number was blocked. She never picked up calls from blocked numbers, especially at this hour. She'd learned that lesson the hard way after a few too many strange, late-night calls. But tonight was different. There was something off, something nagging at the back of her mind. She wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the fact that she had been feeling a little off lately, her skin tingling with a persistent sense of unease, even when the apartment was empty and still. Her instincts flared, and her fingers moved almost on their own, tapping the green icon. She pressed the phone to her ear, holding her breath. "Hello," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling ever so slightly. The other end was dead silent. She could hear only the faintest crackling, like static. But then a deep, drawn-out breath filled the line. It wasn't a normal breath. It was too slow, too heavy, like something trying to mimic a human, but failing miserably. Maggie's grip on the phone tightened. She held the receiver closer to her ear, her eyes darting to the clock on her nightstand. 2:44 a.m. "You're not safe," the voice rasped, its words distorted, garbled, and wet, like it was coming from under the earth, deep and suffocating. It sent an icy jolt of fear into her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She froze. The world outside her apartment felt even quieter now, like the whole universe had paused to listen. Her heart hammered in her ears as she pressed the phone tighter to her face. "Who is this?" Maggie demanded, but her voice was small, barely a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was asking for answers, or if she was simply trying to hold on to some semblance of control. A low, gurgling laugh echoed from the other side of the line, chilling her to the bone. The voice returned, dragging its words out like corpses dragged through mud. "I see you. I've always seen you. You won't last the night." Maggie's stomach flipped. The words were slurred, slow, like the caller was savoring every syllable, every moment of fear they were creating. It felt too real, too personal, too much like a warning. Her fingers started to tremble. What kind of sick game was this? Was this some kind of prank? But the voice sounded too raw, too visceral, too unsettling to be anything but real. The hair on her neck stood up. Something was wrong. Suddenly, the line went dead. There was no warning, no sound of a click or a disconnect, just the unnerving quiet of an open call. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The clock on her nightstand read 3 a.m., and then the lights flickered, dimming to a murky glow before going completely out. Her pulse shot up. Darkness surrounded her. In the pitch-black silence, her breath felt too loud, too jagged. The apartment felt wrong. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet landing on the cold hardwood floor. She reached for the lamp on her nightstand, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface, but there was nothing. It wouldn't turn on. Not that she expected it to, but that didn't stop the cold fear from gnawing at her insides. Maggie stood up, feeling her way across the room, trying to steady her shaking hands. What the hell was going on? Her mind raced. Was it a power outage? But the air in the room felt too still, too heavy. She should have felt relief, but all she felt was a mounting pressure, like something was closing in on her. Her eyes adjusted to the dark. The apartment was always quiet at night, but tonight the stillness was suffocating. She tried to calm her breathing, to make sense of what was happening. Maybe she was just overreacting. Maybe it was all just a strange coincidence. A prank, like the ones she'd seen online, where the person on the other end of the line just tried to mess with you. Then the floor creaked. It was so faint, so soft, but Maggie froze. She could hear it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. The sound of something, or someone, walking on the hardwood floor of the living room. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't move. She couldn't. The footsteps continued, coming closer. Step creak. Step creak. They were inside her apartment, and they were moving toward her. Maggie's throat closed up. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the floor, her body heavy and stiff with fear. She forced herself to breathe, shallow and quick. She had to think. The apartment was small. There was no way someone could have gotten in without her hearing them. The windows were locked. The doors were all shut tight. She was sure of it. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She could feel them now, in the pit of her stomach. The creeping sensation that someone was right behind her. But when she turned around, there was nothing. The darkness pressed in, suffocating. It was like the air itself was alive, crawling across her skin. And then another creak. The bedroom door was slowly opening. Maggie's breath caught in her chest. She didn't dare move. She couldn't take her eyes off the dark crack in the doorway, where she could barely make out the shape of the doorframe. The door creaked open wider. Her mind raced, her body screaming at her to run, to hide. But there was no hiding in an apartment this small. There was no escaping the feeling that something was in the room with her. And then she saw it. A shadow. Not a person. Not a figure. Just a shape, dark and distorted, standing just on the edge of the open door. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But it was there, watching her. Maggie's heart thundered in her chest, her limbs trembling violently. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body was paralyzed with fear. She couldn't look away from the shape. It felt like hours passed as they stood in that frozen moment, the shadow unmoving, her pulse screaming in her ears. And then, slowly, the shadow began to shift, creeping forward toward her. Her breath hitched in her throat, her legs still refusing to move. It was in the room now. So close. So very close. "You're not safe," the voice whispered again, but this time it was real. It was in the room with her. The darkness swallowed everything. And then, there was nothing but the sound of Maggie's frantic heartbeat and the suffocating weight of fear. Kyle had never been one for believing in ghosts or anything supernatural. He didn't have the patience for it. All the talk of spirits, of hauntings, he wrote it off as fiction, stories meant to keep you up at night, not reality. But tonight, something felt different. The air in his apartment was thick with an unease he couldn't shake. The television flickered in front of him, the low hum of static the only sound in the room as the late-night talk show host cracked jokes that Kyle didn't quite hear. His eyes kept drifting to the window. It was almost 2 a.m., the kind of hour where everything feels too quiet, too still. The streetlights outside cut through the fog in jagged lines, faint glows that barely touched the pavement. But despite the darkness, despite the fact that the world outside seemed asleep, Kyle couldn't ignore the sensation that someone was watching him. He glanced up again, his gaze lingering on the window, but the glass was dark. Just the reflection of his apartment, his tired face staring back at him. Yet in the corner of his eye there was someone just out of focus. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe the fog outside was playing tricks on him, or maybe it was just the late hour messing with his mind. But it looked like a shadow. No, not a shadow, more like a figure, standing still in the reflection. Kyle shook his head. He tried to brush it off. Nothing. Just the way the light played with the fog. That's all it was. But the feeling didn't go away. That nagging, prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like a hand brushing over his skin. He swallowed hard and stood up, his legs stiff, his heartbeat growing faster with each step. He moved slowly toward the window, trying to push aside the rising dread. His palms were suddenly slick with sweat. As he reached for the blinds, he hesitated, a part of him dreading what he might find. But the rational side of his brain kept urging him forward. Nothing was out there. It was just his mind playing tricks. With a trembling hand, he yanked the blinds open, the fabric dragging across the window with a soft squeal. He peered out into the night. Empty. Just the street, the fog, and the dim glow of the streetlights. The world outside seemed as lifeless as the inside of his apartment. He exhaled sharply, feeling an odd mix of relief and embarrassment. He'd been so sure there was someone watching him. His chest loosened a little, the tightness he hadn't even realized he was holding on to starting to fade. Just my imagination, he muttered to himself, letting out a half-laugh. Nothing more. But as he turned to walk away, something stopped him. That strange feeling, that crawling sensation along his spine, hadn't gone away. It gnawed at him, lingering in the pit of his stomach. He felt his eyes drifting back to the window, back to the reflection. At first, he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just the apartment, his tired eyes in the reflection, and the empty street outside. But then, there, in the far corner of the reflection, barely visible at first, was a figure. A man, standing still, almost motionless, just outside the edge of the glass. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. The man wasn't there a second ago. He would have seen him. He should have. Kyle's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in quick gasps. The room seemed to tilt. The floor under him felt too soft, too unstable. He jerked back from the window, his pulse racing. His eyes darted around the apartment, his head spinning. He turned quickly to check the room. There was no one there. No one. Just the clutter of his life. His couch, the TV still flickering, his half-empty coffee mug on the table. The apartment was as empty as it had been before. His mind screamed for him to stop, to make sense of it all. But his feet were already moving, carrying him back to the window before he could even think to stop himself. He turned his gaze back to the reflection. The man was still there. Not in the room, but in the glass, standing in the same spot, his face pale, his eyes fixed on Kyle. He hadn't moved an inch. But Kyle could see him. See every detail in the glass. The man's dark clothes, his tall, thin frame, and that chilling expression. Empty eyes staring back at him with an intensity that made his stomach flip. Kyle's pulse raced. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He reached forward, hand trembling, his breath shallow as he touched the window, his fingertips brushing against the cool glass. The man didn't move, didn't blink. But the longer Kyle stared, the more he noticed about the reflection, the way the man's face seemed wrong. His skin too pale, almost ghostly, his features too sharp, too stiff. The reflection of the man smiled, a slow, unnatural smile that stretched wider and wider, until it seemed impossible for his mouth to open any further. Kyle's heart hammered in his chest as the smile seemed to grow, a twisted grin that was more horror than humor. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It wasn't even a smile of menace. It was empty, devoid of any warmth, any humanity. It was a smile that made him feel like he was looking into the face of something that wasn't alive, something that had never been alive. His body went cold. A wave of terror hit him, raw and unrelenting. The man's reflection wasn't just standing there anymore. He was moving. The smile, still stretched wide, slowly shifted into something else, something darker. The edges of the man's features seemed to melt, twisting as if they were made of smoke, folding in on themselves. His eyes, once hollow and dark, were now wide, unblinking, and as Kyle stared at them, he realized with a sickening certainty that they weren't just empty. They were hungry. Hungry for something. Kyle took a step back, his legs weak, his mind spinning, the room spinning, the walls closing in. He tried to turn, tried to get away, but he couldn't. His body refused to obey. His eyes locked on the reflection, watching the figure shift closer, step by slow step. Please, he couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He could only watch as the man in the window, no, the thing in the window, slowly raised one hand. The fingers were too long, too thin, like the twisted branches of a dead tree. They reached out, reaching through the glass, the fingers stretching unnaturally far, as if they could pass through the window itself. Kyle tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth was dry, his breath caught in his throat. The man's hand was getting closer, closer. He could feel it now, the cold creeping into his bones, the deep, oppressive weight of something not right, something that had no business being here. The hand was so close, just inches away. And then, as his chest constricted in fear, he saw the reflection shift once more. The man smiled, and then the figure moved. Not in the glass, not in the window. It moved, stepping into the room. Kyle's scream tore through the apartment, but it was already too late. Max had always loved his midnight walks. It was a habit, a routine. After a long day of work, he found solace in the cold night air. It was the only time he felt truly alone, free from the noise of the world, his mind clearing with each step. The quiet darkness helped him think, helped him breathe. It was during one of these walks, when the chill of the air nipped at his skin, that he noticed something strange. He had walked the same path countless times, but tonight was different. There, just off the worn trail, hidden among the thick trees and heavy fog, stood a house. Max paused, his breath catching in his throat. He could have sworn he'd never seen it before. He pulled out his phone, the glow of the screen illuminating his face for a moment as he checked the map. There was nothing. No sign of this house, no marker, no street. It shouldn't have been there. The house itself seemed to grow darker the longer he looked at it, as though the shadows in the forest were thickening around it, pulling it deeper into the earth. Its windows were dark, but there was something inviting about it, as if it were waiting for him. He shook his head. It didn't make sense. He'd walked this trail hundreds of times and never seen a house here. Maybe it was an old cabin, one he had missed before. But as he stood there, staring at it, something didn't feel right. Max took a step closer, his feet moving of their own accord. And then a sound. At first, it was soft, almost like the wind pushing through the trees. But then the knock came again. Louder this time. A firm, steady knock against wood. Max froze. It was coming from the house. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure why, but the sound sent a shiver down his spine. No one lived out here, not in these woods. It was too far off the beaten path, too isolated. He had never heard of anyone in the area who would be out here at this hour. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to go closer. His legs, almost against his will, carried him toward the door of the house. The front door creaked open, just a crack, and a figure stepped out. Max's heart raced as he looked at her. The woman stood in the doorway, framed by the darkness behind her. Her figure was almost ethereal in the dim light. She was wearing a long, white dress, the fabric flowing around her like smoke. Her hair was long and dark, falling in tangled waves around her face, which was hidden in shadow. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft and airy, like the rustle of dry leaves blowing across the ground. Max's mouth went dry. He didn't know what to say. His instinct told him to turn around, to run, to leave this place and never look back. But his body moved forward, as if it didn't belong to him anymore. Step after step, he walked toward the door, closer to her. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. But his feet didn't stop. The woman smiled as he reached the door, her lips curling upward, but it wasn't a smile that eased him. No, it was cold, hollow. Max's breath hitched as he looked at her face. And that's when he saw it. Her eyes. At first, he thought they were just too deep, shadowed by the night. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized there were no eyes at all. There were only empty, black holes where her eyes should have been. Deep, endless pits that seemed to stretch into nothing. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared at him. Hollow, unblinking, and empty like a void. Max's stomach turned. His feet had moved him too far now, too close to the woman, and yet all he could think about was the hole in her face, the nothingness staring back at him. He took a step back, his body shaking, but the woman's smile grew wider. Her mouth stretched unnaturally, her lips pulling back in a way that felt too wrong. Max tried to turn, tried to flee, but his legs wouldn't listen. His body refused to obey his mind. The world around him blurred, the air thick with dread and the scent of something rotten. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat was tight, as though something was pressing in on him, smothering him from the inside. The darkness around him seemed to close in. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him inside before he could even think to turn back. He stumbled backward, his heart thudding in his chest. The house was silent now. The woman was gone. But the air was wrong. It was colder. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was alive, breathing. Max could feel it. Something was moving in the shadows. The floor creaked underfoot as if someone was walking behind him. But when he turned, there was nothing. Just the dark corners of the house stretching out in all directions. "Hello," he called out, his voice weak, his hands shaking. Nothing. But then a low whisper, like the wind calling his name. He spun around, eyes wild, but saw no one. The house was empty. He had to get out. He had to leave. The panic was building inside him, his pulse racing. But no matter where he went, no matter which direction he turned, there was no escape. Every door was locked. Every window was sealed tight. Max's mind raced, but his body refused to act. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing heavier, thicker. Then the whisper came again. This time, it wasn't from the air. It was from behind him. "Max," the voice said, soft but unmistakable. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his gut, his heart slamming against his ribs. The woman stood there again, her dark eyes empty, her smile wide and cold. She stepped closer to him, her feet silent against the wooden floor, her presence suffocating. And before he could do anything, before he could even think, she reached out and touched his arm. Max screamed, but the world went black. When they found Max the next morning, there was no sign of the house, no trace of the woman, just an empty clearing in the woods where nothing had ever stood. And Max's shoes, neatly placed on the ground. No one knew what happened to him. No one except for Max. But he was never found again. Samantha's feet thudded softly against the cold pavement as she hurried toward the train station. She had missed the last bus, and now the late-night train was her only option. The streets were empty, the city quiet. It was always like this at this hour. Empty, almost too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. She arrived at the station just as the clock above the platform ticked to 12:35 a.m. The usual crowd of commuters had long since gone, leaving the station eerily empty. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, muffled by the fog that clung to the air. She stood alone under the flickering lights, staring at the tracks, waiting. As she looked down the platform, something caught her eye. The train. It wasn't the usual sleek, modern train she was used to. This one was old, too old. Its surface was rusted, the paint peeling in long strips, exposing the metal beneath. The windows were cracked in places, and the lights flickered weakly as if struggling to stay on. Samantha squinted, wondering if she was just tired. Maybe she had misread the schedule. The train shouldn't have been here. But it was. And it was the last one. She didn't have much of a choice. The station was quiet, and there was no other way home. She checked her phone, no service. With a small sigh, she walked toward the train, her shoes clicking on the concrete. The train doors slid open with a soft hiss as she reached them. There was no conductor in sight. No passengers either. She stepped inside, the door closing behind her with an echoing sound that sent a strange shiver down her spine. The inside of the car was dimly lit, the lights hanging from the ceiling flickering in and out like dying fireflies. Samantha chose a seat by the window and sat down, glancing around. The train was so quiet. The air smelled stale, like dust and neglect. As the train began to move, she felt a strange unease settle in her chest. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks was comforting at first, but as the train picked up speed, something didn't feel right. The train was too slow. It was dragging, struggling along the tracks, the clatter of the wheels uneven and harsh. Samantha's brow furrowed. Something was wrong. She looked out the window, but the darkness outside offered no answers. The city lights were far behind her now, replaced by a stretch of trees and empty fields. The lights overhead flickered again, then went out completely, plunging the car into darkness. Samantha froze. The train continued to move, but the lack of light and the unsettling slowness of the wheels made her heart race. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone, but the screen was black. No signal. Just darkness, both inside the train and outside the window. Then a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "You shouldn't have come." Samantha's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't just in her head. It was real. She wasn't alone. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked around, her eyes straining to see anything in the pitch-black car. Another flicker of light, then a dim glow from somewhere far ahead of her, illuminating the train in an eerie, ghostly light. She wasn't alone. A figure appeared across from her in the darkness. It was tall, but hunched, as though it had been bent out of shape. The figure's face was covered in grime, its eyes hidden in shadow, but she could feel its gaze on her. Its body was twisted and contorted in a way that no human body should be. It leaned in closer, a strange, gurgling noise escaping from its throat. "You missed your stop," the figure hissed, its voice low and raspy, like a whisper from the grave. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't move. She wanted to scream, but no sound came from her mouth. Her body felt heavy, frozen in place. She tried to look away, but the figure was all she could see, its twisted face inches from hers. She could smell it now, an overpowering stench of decay, like something long dead. The train continued to roll forward, but now it felt like they were sinking into something. Time had stopped. The rhythm of the train's clattering wheels had changed. It was slower now, more labored, as though the tracks themselves were unwilling to bear its weight. Samantha's hands trembled as she reached for the door, but when she touched the handle, it didn't budge. It was as though the train had sealed her in. The air felt thick, suffocating. The figure's face twisted into a grin, its teeth sharp and yellow, glistening in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, its voice louder now, more insistent, like a chant. A sudden, violent jolt threw Samantha forward, slamming her against the seat. The train lurched, the lights flickering back on for a split second. In that brief instant, she saw the figure clearly. Its eyes were dark, hollow pits, the skin of its face stretched too tight. It grinned again, its mouth opening impossibly wide. The train wasn't on the tracks anymore. It was sliding, gliding through something else, something otherworldly. The windows were no longer showing the dark night outside. They showed a black void, empty, endless. Samantha felt a pull, as though the train was being dragged into a place where no one could hear her scream. She pressed her palms to the cold glass, staring out into the void. It was never ending. There was nothing. Nothing except the train, dragging her deeper into the darkness. Then a thud. The figure's hand, large and cold, gripped her wrist. Its nails were long, jagged, digging into her skin like claws. "Your stop is next," it whispered. Samantha's blood ran cold as the figure's face hovered closer. Her body was frozen, the terror consuming her. The train was slowing now, its rattling becoming more erratic. She wanted to scream, but the words were caught in her throat. The train jerked to a halt, the lights flickering again. Silence filled the car, heavy and thick. For a moment, Samantha thought it was over, but then she heard a soft creak. The door ahead of her had opened. A dark figure stood there, just outside the train. It was tall, much taller than a man, and its outline was hard to distinguish in the dim light. The figure raised a hand, a long finger pointing toward her. She didn't move. She couldn't. The whispering voice returned, louder this time, like a distant scream. "Get off the train, Samantha," it hissed. And then, with no warning, the figure reached for her. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the twisted smile on its face, as if it had waited for her all along. The next morning, the train station was busy as usual, but no one talked about the train that had never arrived. No one spoke of the last train home. and Samantha was never seen again. Ben had just moved into his new apartment, a small place tucked away on the third floor of an old building. The building had its quirks, creaky floors, an elevator that rarely worked, and a faint smell of dust and mildew that never seemed to go away. But Ben didn't mind. It was cheap, and he was ready for a fresh start. The place had character. There was, however, one thing about the apartment that unsettled him: the old wooden door at the end of the hallway. The door didn't seem to lead anywhere, not on the floor plan at least. It was just there, tucked in the back corner of the apartment, always a little too heavy when he tried to open it. No matter how hard he tried, it would always creak open slowly, as if something was pulling it shut from the inside. Ben hadn't thought much of it at first. It was probably just a storage closet, he assumed. The building was old, after all. Some parts were probably unused, forgotten about. But as days passed, he started to feel the door watching him, waiting for him to do something about it. It was always there, looming, reminding him that it was something he had yet to understand. One night, after an exhausting day of unpacking, Ben sat down on the couch with a cold beer in hand, staring blankly at the TV. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of the wind outside. He tried to push the door out of his mind, but something kept nagging at him. What was behind it? Why did it feel wrong? Finally, after hours of sitting in silence, the curiosity became unbearable. He set the beer down on the coffee table and grabbed his flashlight from the drawer. He needed answers, even if they scared him. He walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under his weight. When he reached the door, he stopped. The air felt thick around it, heavy and oppressive, as though something inside was waiting for him. There was no key for the door, just a handle that he could pull. It never stayed locked, but it never opened easily either. He gripped the handle tightly and pulled. The door creaked slowly, like it had a mind of its own, reluctant to move. Ben grunted, pushing harder, until the door gave way and swung open with a sudden, almost angry motion. The room on the other side was completely empty, save for one thing. On the far wall, something was written in dark, sticky letters. Ben's heart dropped into his stomach. The writing was scrawled messily, as if the words were being forced out of the wall itself, and it was clear that whatever had written them had no intention of being neat. "Get out!" Ben's blood ran cold. The room didn't exist on the floor plan. He was sure of it. There was no room like this, no space in the building that should have been hidden behind this door. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving the words. The flashlight in his hand flickered for a moment, casting the words in shadow. The air felt colder, and his breath came in sharp gasps. Suddenly, the flashlight went out completely. Darkness swallowed the room, and Ben froze, panic rising in his chest. He tried shaking the flashlight, tapping it, but it didn't come back on. The silence in the room felt suffocating, and then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, he heard something. A faint shifting sound behind him. Slowly, he turned around. The door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, a loud bang that seemed to echo through the apartment. Ben's heart raced in his chest. He spun back to the wall, the words still there, but now they seemed different, more threatening. The air around him felt wrong, as though it was thickening, closing in on him. He rushed to the door, but it was locked. He slammed his shoulder into it, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to shift, the walls stretching in toward him. Ben's breath quickened, his hands shaking. There was no way out. The door wouldn't open. Then the whispers started. They were soft at first, like distant murmurs, but they grew louder, more distinct. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, cold, hollow, desperate. They came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, as though the room itself was alive and suffocating him with its breath. Ben pressed his back against the door, his legs trembling beneath him. He tried to speak, to call for help, but his voice was swallowed by the whispers. His mind raced, every thought consumed by fear. What was happening? What was this place? The room didn't exist. It couldn't exist. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more frantic, until they were no longer whispers at all. They were voices, screaming, begging, pleading. Get out! Get out! Get out! Ben slapped his hands over his ears, but the voices only grew louder. The walls trembled as if something was moving behind them, something massive, pressing against him. The room was alive with malice and rage. He could feel it, feel the anger of whatever force was in the room with him. His pulse throbbed in his ears. His breath was shallow, his vision starting to blur. He had to get out. There had to be a way out. He could feel the darkness closing in, the air growing thick and suffocating. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Then a new voice broke through the chaos. It was different from the others. It was low, almost soothing in its tone. You shouldn't have opened the door, the voice whispered. Ben's heart skipped a beat. His head snapped up, his eyes searching the room. There was nothing. No one. Just the empty walls. But he wasn't alone. The whisper came again, this time from right behind him. You shouldn't have opened the door, it repeated, louder now, but still soft, calm, as though it was trying to comfort him. Ben spun around, his flashlight still useless in his hands, his legs unsteady beneath him. There was no one there. Get out! The voices screamed again, louder and more insistent. The room was moving now. The walls seemed to be closing in on him, pushing him toward the center. His chest tightened as if something was pressing down on him. He could feel the floor buckling beneath his feet, the air thick with the sound of something scraping against the walls. Ben tried to move, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The whispers turned into shrieks, into screams that rattled his bones. He felt the walls pressing in on him, the room becoming smaller, darker, more suffocating. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, everything stopped. The screams went silent. The walls stopped moving. The darkness was still. Ben stood frozen in the center of the room, sweat pouring down his face, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know how long he stood there. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. But when the door opened, it was as if nothing had happened. The room was empty again. The writing was gone. Ben stumbled out of the room, gasping for air, his legs shaking beneath him. He never spoke of what happened that night. He couldn't. But from that moment on, he never went near that door again. The apartment, the building, and everything in it had become something else, something he couldn't explain. But he knew one thing for sure. Some doors should never be opened. Some rooms should never be entered.